Welcome to the R and Cosmos studio, where we'll discuss naval strategy and lessons from the war in Ukraine. We are fortunate to welcome Emmanuel Véran today. Hello.
Hello, Xavier. Hello, everyone.
You specialize in naval issues, a bit in China, but you are also a professor at the Naval School. A strategic vision in the field is also helpful. What a shift. A navy-less country seriously damaged the world's second largest fleet. The main fleet of the Black Sea is now forced to hide in Novorossiysk. How is that possible?
Well, what's interesting and first comes to mind when discussing this is knowing the enemy. The Ukrainian side thoroughly understands the Russian side due to their shared fundamentals and training. And for good reason, because there's a shared history, experiences that are perfectly known to both sides. So that means there's an understanding of the weaknesses beforehand, and there's a particularly clever exploitation of those weaknesses and various vulnerabilities. Then there's the second point we can consider, which is the mobilization of the weak against the strong. In the asymmetric dimension, striking where it hurts using modern, advanced, and not necessarily expensive means. We'll likely expand on this subject, particularly using drones or affordable equipment. A few thousand to tens of thousands of euros paid to hit targets with major consequences.
So, you mean that the Ukrainians have two advantages? They know the Soviet and therefore Russian method. And in the same way, it's exactly the opposite on the Russian side, where they look down on the Ukrainians. They never imagined that their cruise missiles would hit their Moskva. They never imagined that with such asymmetric means, they would manage to sink a third of the ships and half the tonnage of the fleet.
Especially in this strategic maritime area where many important events are unfolding, including with NATO or Turkey, which is the Black Sea. We'll revisit that. So that's clear. The issue of asymmetry, the issue of the means to strike targets in a significant way. I would add one topic, for example, the Moskva, in the feedback and observation of the general context. Or other ships, it's a kind of Russian or post-Soviet Russian strategic culture of ships that are not well protected, poorly protected. That is, in different kinetic attacks, etc. That is, in addition to the asymmetric dimension, the ships, and in particular, that was the case with Moskva, were quite poorly protected, which is one of the reasons for its neutralization.
The Moskva was supposed to provide air defense for the ships in the Black Sea. Once it sank, the other ships were left vulnerable.
Here we return to prior knowledge, particularly from a military and tactical perspective. It was theater by hitting the Moskva.
But in the end, the air defense of the ships, including the Moskva, disappointed. As seen with systems like the S-300, the
S-400.
Even loyal clients like India are now trying to avoid purchasing the latest models they had ordered due to the equipment being openly full of holes. They see it's not up to par, but that's a separate discussion. What are the consequences for us? I mean us. We have a nice fleet, we have beautiful ships, we have beautiful submarines. What if tomorrow we face a country that has it in for us, but isn't as rich as we are? Could they make us suffer the same setback by damaging our fleet with drone submarines that cost $500?
Actually, it makes me think about what we're capable of doing in terms of industry, defense, or on an industrial scale. In France, simply put, we make luxury goods, which is excellent. Luxury in every field, actually. I'm considering aircraft, ships, defense systems, and more. But the topic is in light of the experience and the feedback from the war in Ukraine. Since at least 2014, particularly 2022, it's that the expensive, sophisticated, so in quotes, the luxury, you get my metaphor, doesn't necessarily guarantee, if I may say so, no. Not a superiority, but it doesn't allow for a sufficient level in saturation. And to go back to something more rustic, that's the crucial question for Western society, particularly in Europe. But it's also true for the United States or other societies that observe China from South Korea or Japan.
Taiwan
is a subject that is important to mention when discussing the standardization and simplification of things. Things that are, in quotes, not lower quality, but much less expensive to produce, but that we no longer know how to make. So typically equipment for daily and mass use, meaning producing in large quantities, ammunition, shells, and so on. Less expensive options, such as developing a drone, won't cost millions. But devices that are much more basic and much less expensive with an effectiveness that is significant.
I wouldn't call it low end, it's really low cost. I'll give a very concrete example. The Ukrainians are deploying their Magura, their famous small vessels, which are suicide in most cases. But they've also developed this model where it carries a kamikaze drone They open it up and go attack gas stations right in the middle. They get close to the coast and hit a section of wax. Basically, for 300 euros, they destroy a section of wax. Whereas we would use at least an air-to-ground missile, 88 type missile, or a cruise missile that costs 1,000 times more.
Pretty much, yes.
To be efficient and effective doesn't mean we have to give up on the top tier. Exactly, but are there any countries today that have understood this? Or are we still preparing a defense against these alternative wars? But we refuse to stoop to using these weapons of the weak.
There is only one cultural issue and one cultural issue in the defense industry. That's why I was discussing luxury today. But whoever lost that idea, lost even that culture, that means we should go back to entrepreneurship, invest with the support of the state and various banks like Banco Português, De Investimento and others, to have less expensive systems somewhere, so less sophisticated as you describe, and which have a truly significant impact. That's why I insist on the word, whether it's the naval drone component, and we see the effectiveness. That's our topic today. On the naval side, especially in the Black Sea, on the Ukrainian side, but also clearly in the aerial dimension. And when we look at the issues of superiority, of control of the skies today, air superiority, at first glance, we're not there yet, unfortunately. When facing issues in China, especially in Russia, despite the war and economic weakening and part of its economy being directed toward its defense industry, on the Western side, we're not there.
In other words, we don't truly accept it theoretically. Are the Americans and British, who are often said to be more pragmatic, different in this regard? Also, do they have even less money than we do? Aren't there countries that are opening their eyes? Because I feel like on a global level, which countries actually know how to do it? I'm talking about low-cost aerial drones.
China.
Russia, Iran, North Korea, and
Ukraine. It's
the 5 countries in the world that know how to do it. And it's going to stay that way. And in the naval sector, ultimately, it's the same thing. It will remain with second-tier countries like Iran, who will try to compensate for their inferiority. And the Americans will watch and will forbid themselves from doing that.
It's very much linked to the industrial culture of the countries, especially if we quickly examine those aspects in the United States. There's always the matter of doing the best, being top of the top, and so necessarily the
most expensive.
And so in a way, the most sophisticated. And we look at different programs. If we look at the F-35 program for the air dimension, etc. If you look at the Zumwalt program, that kind of incredible ship, it's extremely expensive, 1.5 billion or even more per unit. And we look at how it's used, complicated to say the least. Industrial culture plays a crucial role in innovation, implementation, and use in a theater of operations. And in real war, in modern warfare, what's interesting to see is whether there will be a change in culture or not, politically and industrially. And probably the war in Ukraine, which has already caused a lot of movement, a lot of changes, could, in the short to medium term, suggest or bring about these cultural changes, in particular with more low-cost equipment, less expensive.
It should, but it isn't working out for now.
Not yet. In the short to medium term, I think things could change, but...
Is it also a matter of goals or ambition? We're discussing openly imperialist nations like expansionist Russia and China that ultimately seek to take action, or else about denial of access, like Iran. Is it because we, as Europeans and Americans overall, no longer have expansionist ambitions? We don't want to enforce access denial. The English Channel is open to everyone. That's why we don't stoop to using those weapons. At least for now, either we really don't know how to do it, or we simply don't want to.
I think we don't know how to do it anymore, we just don't know how.
We don't know how to do low cost?
We don't know how to do it anymore, so we can't really do so-called low cost. Afterwards, linking the subject to an expansionist, imperialist, or neo-imperialist political behavior, maybe over time, it's connected. That, I don't know, it's a reflection, if I may say so, intellectual and historical. But fundamentally, it's about having abandoned over time the rustic aspect to a certain extent. So, from making and manufacturing bullets for a handgun all the way to drone technology, and the failure, even though we're trying to correct the course of drone technology in our armed forces, especially in France over the past 20 years, somehow having missed the boat on drone technology. When you take, for example, the Russian drone program Landsat, which is now widely industrialized, the planning first tests and military trials lasted at least 2 to 2.5 years in the Syrian theater. Starting from 2021, we are now in 2025, and it is widely used in the context of the war in Ukraine. This subject is not very costly and is industrialized in Russia's defense industrial and technological base. In Western Europe, at this stage, we are still unable to be on this type of program. This raises a political issue and a question of cultural environment in relation to the defense industrial and technological base. That is the way we design and think about defense tools and weapons. This also covers investment matters, which is why I connect it to the political subject of investing in various sectors.
Particular program?
And therefore of will.
Now let's consider the opposite case. We still lack affordable, versatile, small ships. But how do we protect ourselves? So I'm going to put myself in a very concrete situation. How does Russia stand today? What should we do to be able to regain control in the Black Sea? When facing a country that has brilliantly applied all the methods of hybrid warfare up to now?
The issue is one of withdrawal, first geographically and tactically, and ultimately of efforts, capabilities, and so on, of the industry itself and of the military sites. But what's interesting is that at this stage, Russia is not at all able to regain, so to speak, any territorial advantage. They are absolutely not able to do so. So at this stage, they are in a process of rebuilding their forces by using the strategic depth of the territory, the depth of Russian territory, which doesn't mean that in 5 to 10 years, or even 3 to 5 years, depending on the circumstances, if I may say so, of NATO security architectures, the rise or not of European defense industries, and the coordination of American military power with Europe, meaning NATO. Well, within the framework of the Russian reconstruction of the whole system, we could have that. Whether it's electronic warfare, the missile-to-missile excel dimension, the drone dimension, whatever type of drone, etc. A possibility to push back toward Ukraine and the Black Sea.
The manufacturer's response is apparent when you see them. Is there a technical solution, for example? I'll use the same example as before of the kamikaze naval drones, but with a helicopter overhead instead. Hoping to hit them and hoping that these naval drones don't have anti-air missiles themselves, like the Ukrainians just did to shoot down 2 Mi-8s.
I think it's an issue of constant feedback and learning from experience in the general staffs, of course, but also at the industrial level, all across the land, naval and air domains, since at least February 2022. And everyone is trying to understand, to observe, and so on. But since the situation in Ukraine is in the Black Sea, I'll make a connection with the naval situation, also in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. And the kinetic dimension, with the tools focused especially on maritime lines of communication, in which French naval forces have been very involved as part of Aspides. Operation at the European level, but since the French Navy is pretty much the only one that matters in the exercise, in the operation, so it's a topic that comes up every day. But there are industrial inertias, especially when it comes to something very sophisticated compared to something less so. So the time it takes to put things in place always comes down to a matter of will and investment in public affairs by the state. And in strategic sectors, we won't have full implementation. So we're still in a phase of exploration and reflection. At this stage, I don't yet see any real application in these asymmetric approaches.
It will take a few years, similar to how developing effective, improvised explosive device jammers took years before deployment. It'll take time to apply them, hoping the war doesn't move too fast?
Yes, absolutely. The key issue is gaining an advantage in war by winning before it even starts, as the Chief of Defense Staff has stated on this matter. To take the measure of combining sophistication with, I want to stress that it is more rugged and less sophisticated, making it immediately deployable and effective, whether at sea or on land.
Do you think that terrorist groups could do what happened to the United States ship Cole when it was attacked? Do you think that terrorist groups today could openly develop these weapons to target oil tankers or cruise ships?
In light of Al-Qaeda, indeed, with the United States ship Cole that you mentioned, an American ship at the end of the 1990s, the rise of Al-Qaeda, especially in its various attacks on, first of all, American targets, or primarily and almost exclusively American targets, the terrorist element is evident, particularly with the spread of weapons, largely due to arms shipments and similar factors. In various theaters, including Ukraine, raises a number of questions. That's clear from a security point of view, it's obvious. To inflict significant losses, either on lines of communication or on infrastructure X or Y, whether governmental or not, in this or that state, that's clear. So the dimension of international terrorism, whether Islamist or not, raises a real issue. given the circulation of weapons and their control, so to speak. What's interesting, if we think a bit further about this, would be the continuum or the interaction that can exist, especially in the control of these weapons. Still within an asymmetric logic, which fits well with the terrorist culture, the strategic terrorist culture with the Russian armed forces. That is to say, we could very well have proxy strategies extended to new theaters. Whether it's the Iranian regime, the Putin regime, or even the Chinese or North Korean regime, who would be in our logic of evolving by proxy, using projected terrorist forces of the grey intermediate category and many kinetic actions on targets that are either military or civilian.
And what's surprising, maybe as a final word, is that when you look at what Russia has endured in Ukraine, whether it's long-distance aerial bombings, low cost, similar to the Islamic State's approach in Syria in 2017, where they destroyed Sukhoi 24s on an attacked base. United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization in 1990. Ultimately, the Ukrainians have enhanced it, clearly with satellite connection. In the end, these lessons learned that we see very clearly today and that have been industrialized by a state, all the boxes were already there. They're the first to do it on an industrial scale. And we're not ready.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's the whole point of having, if I may say so, a head start and a necessary level of protection on both the physical and military aspects, but also on various influences, including those producing operations. And so this will really be the final word, this need in the future, a very, very near future, to combine the rustic with the sophisticated.
All right, some work for the doctrinal experts. Thank you, Emmanuel and Xavier. We hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you soon at the Recosmos studio.